Deep in the mist-covered mountains of the ancient Yellow River Basin, early healers watched the changing seasons and uncovered a chilling truth about human survival that we have completely forgotten. Today, a silent and invisible epidemic of chronic inflammation and adrenal fatigue is quietly breaking people down in our brightly lit modern world. Millions of us wake up every single day feeling deeply exhausted, fighting off sudden sickness, and carrying a heavy, aching weight in our bones for no clear medical reason. We search for answers in tiny pills, synthetic stimulants, and quick medical fixes, completely unaware that our bodies are desperately trying to warn us about a broken biological connection. This modern health crisis is not just bad luck or genetic failure, but the terrifying result of humanity ignoring a profound, ancient circannual rhythm that once dictated our cellular function and kept our ancestors alive. Deep in the shadows of history, scholars recorded a chilling medical mystery in a foundational text known as the Huangdi Neijing. Compiled over 2,000 years ago on fragile bamboo slips and ancient silk manuscripts, this massive collection was never meant to be just a simple medical book filled with gentle philosophical remedies. Instead, it reads like a dark and urgent survival guide for a fragile human race facing a hostile environment. The imperial writers understood with terrifying clarity that stepping out of line with the natural world did not just mean getting a little sick, but invited profound systemic suffering, organ failure, and sudden early death. Those ancient pages held the ultimate warning that ignoring the Earth's thermodynamic laws and shifting barometric pressures would always end in physiological disaster. The imperial scholars documented how failing to adapt to severe temperature drops and shifting daylight hours actively destroyed the body's internal defenses, leaving entire populations completely defenseless against sweeping seasonal plagues. The unsettling core truth of this ancient clinical wisdom is that the human body is not a machine made of separate, easily replaceable parts. It is actually a tiny, fragile biological mirror reflecting the wild earth itself, with specific internal organs directly tethered to the shifting environmental elements occurring just outside the skin. Ancient doctors knew that if the earth freezes and hardens in the dark of winter, the blood and energy inside a person must also undergo severe vasoconstriction to slow down and hide deep within the core. When the world outside burns with the fierce heat of summer, the cardiovascular system and the body must open up and release that same fire through sweat, or risk being consumed by fever from the inside out. We are permanently tied to the dirt, the wind, and the sun, biologically unable to escape the physical climate happening right outside our front doors. Our photoreceptors and skin sensors are constantly gathering raw environmental data, triggering massive hormonal shifts that prepare our internal organs for the specific grueling demands of the current season. But our modern industrialized world has built a massive, dangerous technological lie to hide this fundamental biological truth from us. We live our entire lives in sealed, climate-controlled boxes, blasting artificial heat when the winter snow falls, and pumping freezing air conditioning when the brutal summer sun beats down on the concrete pavement. We are constantly tricking our bodies into a false reality, forcing our endocrine systems to fight against the actual season. This chilling deception leaves our internal networks completely confused, pushing our adrenal glands to work overtime to survive in a fake, static 72-degree climate, while the real world shifts drastically, yet unnoticed, outside our windows. By erasing the natural extremes of hot and cold from our daily lives, we have accidentally turned our own comfortable homes into metabolic traps. The total loss of seasonal thermal stress weakens our cellular immune responses, destroys our baseline metabolic flexibility, and creates a perfect, undisturbed breeding ground for rampant chronic autoimmune disorders. Think about the unexplained, lingering winter respiratory infections that routinely knock you off your feet, or the sudden, violent spring histamine storms and severe allergies that seem to appear completely out of nowhere. Think about that deep, heavy neurological exhaustion that makes it physically agonizing to simply get out of bed in the morning. These are not random failures of your immune system, but the desperate chemical cries of a body torn away from its natural circadian rhythm. With unsettling clinical honesty, The ancient texts explain that when you live an active summer lifestyle in the dead of winter, you are slowly draining your core biological reserves. Every single time we ignore the changing seasons by eating imported summer fruits in December, or staying awake under bright artificial lights during the long winter nights, we pay a severe physiological price. We accumulate a massive compounding biological debt that eventually bankrupts our physical energy, exhausts our organs, and rapidly accelerates our own cellular aging. In the harsh, unforgiving agrarian landscapes of ancient China, the stakes for understanding this environmental connection were incredibly grim. A brutal winter frost could easily wipe out a whole village through hypothermia and starvation if the local people did not know exactly how to stockpile their caloric energy and protect their internal warmth. Aligning with the seasons was never just a healthy lifestyle trend or a relaxing philosophical idea for these early farming communities. It was a brutal, terrifying matter of life and death, where rigorously tracking the 24 solar terms and watching the frost depth meant the difference between surviving the year or freezing in the dark. To survive this hostile environment, early physicians had to empirically master the extreme shifting thermodynamic forces of life known as Yin and Yang. These are absolutely not peaceful, gentle New Age symbols, but rather the raw, violent, and absolute polar physics that constantly rule the Earth's climate and dictate the survival of everything living upon it. Yin represents the dark, freezing, quiet, cellular rest of the deep winter night, while Yang embodies the bright, explosive, violent metabolic heat of the summer sun. Every human body is a fragile biological battleground where these two massive environmental forces must constantly trade power as the seasons change or the entire physical infrastructure falls apart. The quiet and violent forces of Yin and Yang were not just abstract philosophical ideas debated by scholars, but absolute physical laws dictating who lived and who died in ancient China. Medical texts dating back to the Han Dynasty treated these dual energies as the literal foundation of human anatomy, where a sudden shift in their balance could trigger immediate, catastrophic organ failure and widespread seasonal plague. Imagine the sheer terror of feeling these two massive forces slowly tearing apart inside your own chest. For the ancient healers recording symptoms in imperial medical logs, there was no greater dread than watching a patient lose this delicate internal balance, knowing that without it, the human frame would simply collapse under the weight of its own malfunctioning biology, leaving the victim helpless against the elements. A body stripped of its cooling, quiet yin does not just get sick, it literally begins to burn itself alive from the inside out. The heart races to a dangerous rhythm, the mind fractures into violent panic, and the physical form is consumed by a reckless, unchecked heat that boils the blood, scorches the bodily fluids, and leaves nothing but a hollow, exhausted shell of ash behind. This terrifying internal burning was a direct, unforgiving warning that the victim had lost their crucial anchor to the natural world. It was the biological consequence of disobeying the strict seasonal clock, perhaps by exhausting the body during the dark, dormant months of winter, which inevitably triggered a fatal systemic overheating the moment the aggressive solar energy of spring finally arrived to strike them down. To understand how to survive this ongoing biological chaos, early doctors mapped out the 5 elements, which were wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, formally codified by the 4th century BCE. These categories were never meant to be seen as simple piles of dirt, broken sticks, or puddles scattered on the ground, but rather as highly volatile stages of transformation that governed the entire universe. Instead, they were brutal, unstoppable phases of life, violent growth, and inevitable death that ruled every living creature without exception. Each element represented a specific, unforgiving climate, from the scorching, suffocating dampness of late summer to the biting, desiccating dryness of autumn, which the fragile human body had to continuously endure and rapidly adapt to, or face the absolute certainty of disease and sudden death. These 5 survival phases perfectly mirrored the harsh, shifting skies and the unforgiving ground beneath their feet. The 24 solar terms used by agrarian farmers to track impending frosts and monsoons were the exact same atmospheric markers utilized by imperial physicians, because a sudden, unexpected freeze in the agricultural fields guaranteed a corresponding deadly freezing of the blood and vital fluids within the local population. There was a profound, unsettling dread that came with watching one element violently give way to the next, When the dead, frozen water of winter finally cracked and shifted into the aggressive wood of spring, it was not a gentle, poetic awakening, but a violent, disruptive tearing of the earth that triggered massive barometric shifts, severe storms, and sudden spikes in unexplained seasonal mortality rates. The human body was forced to endure this same brutal transition, desperately struggling to wake up its frozen blood and stiff muscles to match the sudden explosive energy erupting from the soil. Tendons strained, blood pressure spiked, and the liver worked in desperate overdrive, making it a painful, exhausting, and highly dangerous fight for biological survival every single time the weather turned and the atmospheric pressure dropped. Surviving this violent shift required much more than just putting on warm clothes or seeking shelter. It demanded a complete, unconditional surrender to the changing environment. Patients were ordered to drastically alter their sleep schedules to match the rising sun, change their diets to pungent, warming greens, and physically move their bodies in specific rhythms, knowing that any refusal meant inviting fatal environmental pathogens directly into their bloodstream. This brings us to the most shocking and chilling truth hidden deep within the foundational texts of traditional Chinese medicine. Your internal organs do not actually belong to you as an independent individual. They belong entirely to the seasons, functioning not as a closed biological loop, but as a series of vulnerable rented spaces occupied and directed by the overwhelming atmospheric energy swirling outside your front door. Your liver is completely owned and controlled by the aggressive, unpredictable wind of spring, while your beating heart is a captive, helpless servant to the scorching heat of midsummer. You are merely a fragile biological host, carrying around pieces of raw nature wrapped in human skin, with lungs bound to the dry decay of autumn and kidneys locked to the freezing lethal depths of the winter solstice. Because these vital organs answer directly to the weather rather than your own brain, they react violently when the seasons change. This absolute environmental dominance explains the sudden, severe asthma attacks that choke populations in the dry autumn air, the fatal strokes that strike during the volatile spring winds, and the catastrophic heart failures that spike precisely when the midsummer heat reaches its most oppressive, suffocating peak. Think about the sudden, dark sadness that often creeps into your mind when the autumn leaves begin to fall, or the wild, restless anger that bubbles up for no apparent reason in the early days of spring. You might casually assume these intense feelings are just in your head, a temporary product of modern workplace stress, a bad day, or a fleeting moment of psychological weakness. But the ancient diagnostic texts reveal a much darker, physical reality, proving this is not in your mind at all. It is the actual physical flesh of your organs, crying out in distress, reacting helplessly to the invisible magnetic pull of the earth, the shifting angle of the sun, and the sudden drop in temperature as the planet violently tilts its axis toward a brand new season. This is precisely why the ancient doctor was never just a mechanic of flesh and bone, but a deeply observant, highly trained reader of the weather. When a severely ill patient walked into a rural clinic, the physician did not just look at their pale, sweating skin, check their bounding pulse, or listen to the rattling, weak cough echoing from deep within their failing, fluid-filled lungs. They immediately looked out the window at the exact direction of the prevailing wind. They felt the heavy dampness of the dirt outside, and they studied the dark, threatening clouds gathering in the sky. By reading these simple, brutal meteorological clues in the environment, they could perfectly predict which specific organ inside the patient was about to collapse under the crushing weight of the shifting climate. This chilling, highly accurate ability to predict internal biological collapse entirely from external weather patterns proved a terrifying reality that modern medicine often forgets. Human health was never an isolated individual achievement, but rather it was entirely at the mercy of nature, representing nothing more than a temporary, incredibly fragile biological truce with a hostile environment that was constantly, relentlessly trying to tear the body apart. Thousands of years ago, during the Han Dynasty, around 206 BCE, physicians compiling the Huangdi Neijing did not look at a human body as a biological machine made of isolated parts. Instead, they mapped the anatomy as a living reflection of stars and storms. They documented the blood in our veins as flowing rivers, our respiratory breath as the driving wind, and our dense bones as the deep, unyielding earth. This profound environmental connection was a matter of basic survival, functioning as a diagnostic language spoken between human flesh and the changing sky. Today, modern medicine often ignores these environmental rhythms, leaving a chilling silence where that ancient wisdom used to be. This disconnect leaves modern populations entirely blind to the invisible atmospheric forces shaping our baseline health, triggering sudden shifts in our moods and driving an epidemic of quiet, chronic suffering. That lost ability to accurately read our own internal weather systems leaves us completely defenseless when the environmental seasons finally shift. Without the traditional practices used to fortify the immune system ahead of temperature drops and barometric pressure changes, the human body is caught entirely off guard, turning a natural planetary transition into a sudden biological crisis. When the bitter winter finally breaks, the arrival of spring is not merely a time of blooming flowers and gentle breezes, but a violent, brutal biological force of awakening. Within the ancient five elements theory known as Wuxing, this volatile season belongs entirely to the element of wood. It represents a period of aggressive cellular turnover, where dormant energy violently pushes outward into the extremities. Consider the immense hydraulic pressure required for a tiny, fragile green shoot to violently tear its way up through dark, frozen, unforgiving dirt. That localized pressure mirrors the raw, unstoppable yang energy of spring. It is an aggressive, upward surge of biological life that demands rapid physical expansion, pushing blood and vital fluids toward the surface of the skin, refusing to be contained by any winter stagnation. Managing that fierce upward thrust of raw wood energy requires a highly specific internal mechanism to prevent systemic overload. The ancient physicians mapped out complex meridian pathways designed exclusively to vent this seasonal pressure, warning that without a dedicated biological regulator, the sudden spike in metabolic activity would tear through the nervous system and trigger severe inflammatory responses. Inside the human body, the liver network is the primary organ system forced to carry the heavy, dangerous burden of this explosive spring awakening. Ancient medical texts literally translate the liver's role to that of a commanding military general. This organ is tasked with filtering stagnant blood and directing this massive surge of new metabolic power through the vascular system, ensuring this sudden influx of energy does not overwhelm the heart. If the liver function is weak, or if its delicate meridian pathways are blocked by chronic stress and poor dietary habits, that rising seasonal force has nowhere to go. The trapped energy builds physiological pressure like a sealed boiling pot. Clinical records from early dynastic periods document this exact stagnation turning rapidly into sharp physical pain, severe cluster headaches, high blood pressure, and sudden, uncontrollable outbursts of deep, irrational anger. The sheer terror of this trapped spring energy is that it effectively turns the human body into a ticking biological time bomb, ready to detonate from the inside out. When the liver fails to distribute this aggressive seasonal momentum, the resulting friction creates localized heat that damages the surrounding tissues, triggering sudden autoimmune flare-ups and leaving the nervous system in a state of constant, exhausting panic. Yet at the exact moment when our bodies are fighting desperately to release this immense internal pressure, modern populations often make a grave, chilling dietary mistake. We blindly continue to consume the heavy, rich, deeply comforting meals like roasted meats and dense root vegetables that kept our core temperatures warm and safe during the bitter, freezing months of winter. Feeding thick, heavy winter food into the explosive, rising energy of spring creates a catastrophic internal metabolic collision. The dense, fat, heavy food acts exactly like a heavy, wet blanket thrown directly over a growing fire. It traps the rising wood energy in the digestive tract, causing the unprocessed nutrients to rot, generating toxic internal dampness, and ultimately allowing stagnant metabolic waste to poison the bloodstream. What should be a vibrant, flowing internal landscape rapidly degenerates into a toxic swamp of biological stagnation. This thick, sluggish environment suffocates the very organs that are trying to bloom, trapping the body in a state of chronic inflammation that manifests as severe brain fog, swollen joints, and a heavy, unshakable physical lethargy that modern medicine struggles to diagnose. To survive this violent seasonal transition, ancient medical masters laid out strict, non-negotiable physical rules for navigating the spring months. You are clinically required to stretch your tendons through practices like Qigong. Walk outside in the fresh morning air to stimulate the lungs, and force yourself to wake up early in exact synchronization with the rising dawn sun. If you refuse these ancient medical commands, choosing instead to hide in bed under heavy blankets as if the winter snow were still falling, you are directly defying the fundamental biological laws of nature. Without deliberate physical movement to guide it, the raw, unspent energy of spring turns highly toxic, actively attacking your joints, stiffening your ligaments, and leaving you paralyzed by a deep, unnatural muscular exhaustion. This stubborn failure to move in harmony with the shifting season transforms the biological gift of new life into a heavy, lingering sickness that haunts your immune system for months. Physicians warned that this specific springtime stagnation lays the destructive groundwork for severe summer illnesses, ensuring that your body remains weak, compromised, and highly susceptible to viral infections long after the flowers have bloomed. As the volatile energy of spring finally burns away, it gives birth to the profound, overwhelming physiological mystery of summer, a season ruled entirely by the relentless element of fire. In traditional texts, this is the time of maximum yang energy, a blinding, dangerous environmental heat that accelerates the human heart rate and pushes all living cellular structures to their absolute peak of biological existence. It is a terrifyingly beautiful environmental extreme, operating as a blazing inferno that gives abundant life to the world but can just as easily scorch the human nervous system. The sheer atmospheric intensity of this summer heat threatens to literally boil away our vital yin fluids, evaporating our internal moisture reserves and leaving us fragile, dangerously dehydrated, and teetering on the very edge of total cardiovascular collapse. Surviving this brutal, blazing peak of summer requires an entirely new set of strict, ancient medical rules designed specifically to protect the heart muscle. Without immediate dietary interventions, mandatory midday rest periods, and precise methods for cooling the blood, this unchecked internal fire will quickly overwhelm the brain's delicate chemistry, threatening to consume the body alive before the autumn winds can finally bring relief. The blazing height of summer belongs entirely to the heart, a time when the ancient healers warned that the human mind is pushed to its absolute limit. Traditional texts like the Huangdi Neijing, compiled over 2,000 years ago, documented how extreme environmental heat accelerates blood flow and taxes the cardiovascular system. In this season of maximum solar radiation, the human spirit fully awakens, absorbing the intense ambient energy of the sun to fuel our deepest physiological passions, cognitive functions, and conscious thoughts. But this brilliant biological awakening hides a terrifying vulnerability within the nervous system. The exact same metabolic fire that brings life can easily spiral into clinical mania, pushing an unprotected mind into profound neurological exhaustion. Ancient physicians observed that prolonged exposure to high summer temperatures overstimulates the sympathetic nervous system, ultimately burning out the delicate rhythm of the heart and leaving the patient severely depleted. When the human heart is forced to race without adequate rest during these grueling summer months, the resulting cardiovascular damage can echo through the body for decades. Medical archives from the Ming Dynasty record thousands of cases where seasonal cardiac stress led to permanent arrhythmias, chronic insomnia, and sudden systemic collapse long after the temperatures finally dropped. This danger was born from a very real ancient terror known simply as summer heat. The old doctors did not view this condition as a mere temperature reading on a clinical thermometer, but as a hostile, invading pathogenic force that actively hunted the weak, the elderly, and the overworked laborers in the fields. It was described in diagnostic manuals as an invisible, suffocating blanket of thermal energy that could silently sneak into open, sweating pores. Once inside, this environmental pathogen paralyzed the internal cooling mechanisms, trapping the body in a state of sudden, overwhelming fever that could spike to fatal temperatures within a matter of hours. Once this external heat breached the protective barrier of the skin, it became a relentless circulatory poison that required immediate, drastic medical action to expel. If left untreated, the trapped thermal energy would rapidly dehydrate the internal organs, thicken the blood, and trigger widespread organ failure before the sun even set. To survive this brutal invasion, the ancients relied on a chillingly specific dietary regimen designed to act as a chemical internal fire extinguisher. They turned to bitterly sharp greens like dandelion root and heavy watery gourds like the traditional watermelon, prescribing these specific foods to flood the digestive system with cooling compounds and physically put out the internal metabolic flames. They also understood the absolute physiological necessity of sweating to regulate core body temperature. Physicians actively administered boiling hot teas and heavily spiced broths during the hottest days of July to force the trapped thermal heat back out through the skin, knowing that holding on to that trapped fire would literally rot the cellular tissue from the inside out. The scorched earth demanded absolute respect, severely punishing anyone who tried to ignore the suffocating reality of the season. Historical records show that laborers who refused to adapt their working hours to the intense solar peaks often collapsed from sudden heat stroke, a condition the ancient texts treated as a near-certain death sentence. Just as the burning sun begins to fade in late August, the ancient Chinese calendar reveals a shocking structural secret completely missing from the modern Western world. There is a hidden fifth season wedged into the agricultural cycle, a strange and unsettling transition period known as late summer, which is ruled entirely by the grounding element of earth. This is not a simple breezy bridge between the extreme heat of August and the crisp cold of October. Instead, it manifests as a period of heavy, rotting stillness where the barometric pressure drops, the air thickens with suffocating water vapor, and the agricultural ground swells with massive amounts of trapped, stagnant moisture. The entire natural world stops moving during this transitional window, suspended in a suffocating blanket of extreme humidity that feels exactly like breathing underwater. Meteorological records from the Yangtze River Basin describe this exact period as a time when clothes refuse to dry, food spoils overnight, and the human lungs struggle to pull oxygen from the saturated atmosphere. This thick, wet air launches a direct, devastating physiological attack on the spleen and the stomach, the very metabolic engines of human survival. The external environment itself becomes a biological weapon, turning the simple daily act of digestion into a grueling, energy-draining struggle against the heavy atmospheric elements pressing down on the abdomen. The ancient practitioners called this specific environmental weapon dampness, visualizing it as a heavy, microscopic sludge that sinks deep into the flesh. This internal humidity physically slows down the stomach lining, leaving the victim feeling chronically bloated, profoundly exhausted, and weighed down by invisible chains that make even the simplest physical movements feel impossible. As the entire digestive process grinds to a painful, sluggish halt under this atmospheric pressure, the entire body is left starved for clean, usable energy. Without the stomach efficiently breaking down nutrients, the blood becomes poor in quality. The muscles begin to atrophy from lack of nourishment, and the immune system rapidly collapses. The true medical terror of this internal dampness is its chilling, well-documented reputation as the invisible thief of human health. It does not strike with the sudden fiery violence of summer heat, but instead creeps silently into the skeletal bones, the synovial fluid of the joints, and even the deepest neurological corners of the aging mind. It can stay hidden in the dark shadows of your anatomy for years at a time, quietly stealing your daily vitality and causing endless, unexplained chronic pain. Modern rheumatology often struggles to name these exact symptoms, frequently dismissing them as general arthritis or fibromyalgia, while the ancient texts clearly identified them as trapped environmental dampness. This lingering internal sludge ultimately becomes a lifelong sentence of heavy, aching fatigue if the human body cannot find a clinical way to dry itself out. The ancient healers warned that once dampness settles permanently into the deep tissues, removing it requires years of brutal, bitter herbal treatments just to reclaim a normal life. Surviving the heavy, stagnant rot of late summer required strict adherence to an ancient survival code. The early healers observed that as the earth grew heavy with moisture, the human body desperately needed grounding, a defense against the creeping dampness that threatened to stall the digestive fires. Their solution was found in the dirt itself, mandating the consumption of yellow, naturally sweet foods pulled directly from the soil. Root vegetables and golden grains were not just meals, but vital medicine designed to stabilize a system under siege from the humid, suffocating atmosphere. But with this prescription came a chilling warning, a strict prohibition that carried the weight of life and death. To consume raw, cold foods during this oppressive period was considered a fatal error, an act that would literally freeze the stomach and halt the body's internal engine. The ancient texts warned that introducing cold into a system already battling heavy dampness would cause the digestive fire to sputter and die, leaving the victim bloated, exhausted, and vulnerable to chronic decay. This delicate balancing act against the damp rot was the only way to ensure the body remained strong enough to face the brutal shift that was rapidly approaching. As the heavy humidity finally broke, it was replaced by something far more severe, a sudden biting shift into the season of autumn and the unforgiving element of metal. The ancient practitioners watched the world transform as chilling winds began to strip the trees bare, leaving behind a stark, desolate landscape of dying leaves and graying sky. This was not viewed as a gentle transition, but a harsh, necessary death, a time when the earth itself seemed to mourn the loss of summer's vibrant life. To live through this season was to confront a profound, inescapable sense of grief that hung in the very air you breathed. The ancients understood the psychological toll of this stark reality, recognizing that the dying world outside mirrored a quiet, internal mourning within every human being. It was a brutal period of contraction, where the survival instinct demanded that one pull inward, bracing for the cold darkness that was slowly tightening its grip on the world. This chilling wind of metal spared no one, cutting through the final warmth of the year, and signaling that the time for growth was officially over. In this desolate landscape, the physical toll of autumn violently targeted a single vulnerable system, the lungs. The ancient doctors mapped the progression of the seasons and realized that as the atmosphere grew brittle, the lungs were forced to take in this dry, dying air with every single breath. They viewed the respiratory system as the body's fragile canopy, the absolute first line of defense against an environment that was actively trying to strip away moisture and life. The consequences of failing to adapt to this harsh metallic air were swift and terrifying. The medical texts from millennia ago warned that if the lungs could not process the dry wind, the body's exterior would immediately show the signs of internal collapse. The skin would wither and crack like dead leaves, the throat would turn to sandpaper, and eventually, the very breath required to sustain life would begin to fail, leaving the victim gasping in the thinning autumn air. Protecting the fragile respiratory canopy from this invisible drying assault became the paramount focus of every ancient physician. Yet the true danger of autumn was not merely physical. It was deeply psychological, rooted in a chilling demand that the season forced upon the human mind. Just as the trees were forced to drop their dead leaves to survive the coming freeze, autumn demanded that humanity let go of its own accumulated burdens. The ancients observed a disturbing pattern, noting that those who stubbornly held on to old emotional baggage during this time of contraction were the ones who suffered the most catastrophic declines. To harbor deep grief or unresolved anger while the world around you was actively shedding its past was considered a direct violation of natural law. The healers documented how this internal resistance created a toxic blockage in the chest, physically suffocating the lungs and inviting severe, often fatal illness. It was a terrifying revelation, the understanding that refusing to release your emotional ghosts could literally destroy your ability to breathe. The stark reality of the season offered no compromises, demanding a ruthless emotional clearing to match the barren landscape outside. To combat this dual threat of physical dryness and emotional suffocation, the ancients developed a highly specific, almost ritualistic defense strategy. They turned once again to the earth, prescribing a strict diet of white foods which they believed held the exact energetic signature needed to rescue the lungs. Crisp Asian pears, white radishes, and lotus roots were administered like life-saving medicine, their deep, natural moisture acting as an internal shield against the relentless, dehydrating wind of the metal element. Alongside this dietary armor came a strict physical mandate that is still echoed in modern times, the absolute necessity of guarding the back of the neck. The ancient texts identified this specific area as the wind gate, a vulnerable entry point where the chilling autumn drafts could slice directly into the body's core. Wearing a scarf was not a matter of comfort. It was an essential barricade, a desperate measure to lock out the invisible, pathogenic winds that sought to paralyze the immune system. This combination of internal hydration and external fortification was the only proven method to survive the dying breath of the year. But all of these trials were merely preparation for the most terrifying descent of all, the plunge into the deep, dark mystery of winter and the merciless element of water. As the final leaves fell and the earth hardened into ice, the ancient world entered the ultimate test of survival, a deadly freeze that locked the landscape in silence. This was the season of profound darkness, a time when all living things were forced into hiding, retreating deep beneath the surface just to escape the lethal, biting cold that claimed anything left exposed. In this frozen wasteland, the environment launched its most direct and dangerous assault, targeting the kidneys, which the ancients revered as the absolute root of human life. They believed these deep-seated organs held the body's foundational fire, the primal spark of energy inherited at birth. Winter's relentless cold sought to extinguish this very spark, threatening to drain the body's deepest reserves and plunge the internal systems into an irreversible icy death. Facing this dark, deadly grip meant guarding the body's deepest fires against an environment that wanted nothing more than to freeze them solid. The ancient doctors who compiled the foundational medical text known as the Huangdi Neijing laid down an absolute terrifying rule for surviving the bitter cold of winter. They mandated that you must hide your energy deep within the body, retreating from the external world just as the vital sap retreats to the roots of a freezing tree to prevent cellular destruction. This was a strict, unforgiving law of survival that demanded you must not sweat, you must not overwork, and you must never waste your precious internal heat through physical exertion. To push your body to exhaustion during these dark months was seen as a fatal physiological error, an open invitation to rapid aging and an early preventable death. The frozen, desolate landscape outside was a direct mirror of the biological stillness required inside, demanding absolute quiet to protect the fragile spark of human life. Ancient medical scholars observed that lowering the heart rate and minimizing metabolic output were the only proven methods to shield the internal organs from catastrophic environmental shock. A profound, calculated dread surrounded the ancient medical understanding of deep environmental cold. If this freezing, constricting energy was allowed to pierce the skin barrier and enter the skeletal structure, it became a silent, progressive killer, moving steadily through the dark, unprotected spaces of the human body, systematically shutting down circulation. Once the penetrating cold settled into the bones, clinical texts warned that it traveled straight down the meridians to the kidneys, slowly putting out the vital metabolic fire that keeps the human machine running. This deep, paralyzing chill could lie hidden in the tissues for months, quietly draining away a person's core life force from the inside out without triggering immediate alarms. Ancient healers would carefully check the lower lumbar region of the back and press specific diagnostic points on the soles of the feet, searching for any thermal sign that this deadly frost had breached the body's primary defenses. A drop in temperature at the Yongquan acupoint indicated that the kidney meridian was already failing to generate sufficient survival heat. Survival meant strictly consuming a dark, heavy diet, specifically designed to anchor the body's internal heat and build deep nutritional reserves. The mandatory winter table required salty, mineral-rich broths, dark black sesame seeds, and dense root vegetables pulled directly from the freezing earth to fortify the blood and insulate the vital organs against the dropping temperatures. It also required a strict, non-negotiable surrender to the seasonal darkness, mandating sleep from dusk until dawn, storing physical energy exactly like a bear retreating to its cave for hibernation. Every single daily action was mathematically calculated to hoard physical strength, building a heavy, impenetrable biological shield against the deadly freeze waiting just outside the door. This heavy, quiet period of forced human hibernation was the only physiological way to ensure the body had enough stored cellular power to wake up when the ice finally melted. Without this critical period of deep restoration, the foundational essence known as Jing would be entirely depleted, leaving the immune system defenseless against the coming year. Yet modern industrial society does the exact chilling opposite of what the dark season biologically demands. We blast artificial dehydrating heat through our buildings and push ourselves through punishing 80-hour work weeks in December, completely ignoring the desperate, screaming need of our nervous systems to shut down and rest during the darkest days of the calendar. We stay awake late into the freezing night under glaring, synthetic bright lights, eating raw cold foods and drinking iced water while the natural world outside is completely dead. This relentless manufactured modern pace actively crushes the adrenal glands and the kidneys, forcing the body to burn its deepest emergency survival reserves just to endure the corporate winter schedule. Every late-night shift and skipped hour of restorative sleep during the deep freeze acts as a direct, violent attack on the body's most fragile winter regulatory systems. The sympathetic nervous system remains locked in a state of high alert, flooding the bloodstream with stress hormones when the body should be repairing its damaged tissues in total darkness. This constant, arrogant battle against the natural biological order comes with a brutal, delayed punishment that modern medicine frequently misinterprets. The sudden, violent respiratory flu that strikes a population in the spring, or the massive autoimmune burnout that destroys a person's career in the autumn, is never a random accident of viral exposure. These sudden health crashes are the direct, measurable consequence of fighting the absolute physiological rules of the winter months prior. When you stubbornly refuse to hide your energy and rest during the deep freeze, your cellular infrastructure simply collapses when the environmental shift commands the body to push outward and bloom. Doctors today routinely treat the sudden spring fever or the acute seasonal infection with antibiotics, completely missing the underlying systemic failure. They fail to recognize that the true root cause of the illness was a winter lived in total, unrelenting exhaustion, where the patient's core vitality was entirely spent fighting the natural urge to hibernate. We are a society living entirely on borrowed biological time, running a dangerous, invisible deficit that we can never truly repay. Using synthetic caffeine, refined sugar, and fake blue light to violently push through winter exhaustion is literally stealing finite cellular energy from our future selves, guaranteeing a premature physical collapse. Every cup of coffee used to fight the natural winter darkness is a high-interest loan taken out against your own genetic lifespan. Eventually, the biological debt comes due, and the human body simply breaks down, entirely drained of the deep, essential reserves it was supposed to quietly build and protect while the world was cold. The artificial, fluorescent glow of the modern office block entirely erases the natural darkness, blinding us to the terrifying reality of our own physiological bank accounts. We march confidently through the winter months, completely unaware that our internal batteries are running completely dry, setting the stage for a catastrophic failure we will not see coming. We walk blindly through climate-controlled concrete boxes, completely numb to the ancient atmospheric rhythms that once strictly dictated human survival. It remains a profound and unsettling mystery how quickly modern society forgot that beneath the tailored clothing, synthetic fabrics, and glowing digital screens, we are still biological animals bound to the earth. We constructed a fragile plastic reality where artificial daylight is summoned instantly with a wall switch and the bitter winter cold is banished by a central thermostat. This modern arrogance violently severed our deepest biological roots, leaving us drifting in a synthetic void, entirely disconnected from the axial tilt and spinning of the planet that originally gave us life. This profound isolation from our fundamental animal nature forces the human body to constantly fight its own immediate environment, draining vital cellular reserves just to maintain a temporary illusion of control. The constant biological friction required to ignore the changing weather outside creates a silent, invisible tax on the immune system that compounds with every passing decade. The tragic result of this environmental separation is a modern medical cycle that perpetually chases physiological ghosts while completely ignoring the shattered circadian foundation. Millions of patients swallow daily antihistamine pills to suppress a sudden spring allergy or take heavy pharmaceuticals to numb a crushing winter depression, desperately trying to silence the body when it sounds these seasonal alarms. These patients remain completely unaware that they are merely treating the superficial symptoms of a severely broken internal clock. The underlying internal organs are desperately crying out for proper seasonal alignment, but instead of fixing the broken biological gears and resetting the physiological timing, we simply use chemical interventions to muffle the desperate ticking of a failing system. By chemically muting these desperate physical signals, the true systemic damage goes completely undetected by routine blood tests and standard screenings, allowing the internal machinery to quietly degrade year after year. The hidden cost of this artificial comfort is a steady, irreversible decline in organ function that masquerades as normal human aging while actually being accelerated environmental starvation. To prevent this quiet internal decay, ancient Chinese medical practitioners developed the complex movement system of Qigong, which was never originally meant to be just a gentle, relaxing morning exercise. It was methodically engineered over centuries as a critical, life-saving survival tool, specifically designed to force vital energy through failing neurological and vascular systems during harsh weather transitions. When the frail human body could no longer naturally synchronize with the violently shifting weather, specific rhythmic breathing patterns and precise physical movements were used to manually pump the necessary seasonal energy through dying internal organs. It functioned as a deliberate physical override, a mechanical way to jumpstart the heart or the liver when the natural atmospheric connection had grown dangerously weak. This manual pumping of deep breath and calculated motion forcefully pushed stagnant blood to circulate through constricted vessels, deliberately clearing the dangerous physical blockages that would otherwise lead to sudden, fatal physiological collapses. Physicians observed that patients who failed to move this internal pressure during the stagnant winter months often suffered catastrophic strokes the moment the spring temperatures began to rise. The absolute stakes of failing to maintain this critical internal flow are documented with terrifying clinical clarity inside the medical chapters of the Huangdi Neijing. The foundational ancient text does not offer gentle wellness advice, but instead delivers a chilling, absolute warning to any individual who dares to completely ignore the physical turning of the earth and the shifting of the solar calendar. The manuscript states plainly that those who actively rebel against the dominant seasonal energies will face a brutal physical reckoning, aging rapidly and visibly as their delicate internal harmony permanently shatters. The ancient text explicitly warns that ignoring these rigid environmental laws directly invites severe neurological madness into the mind and sudden, unexplained, catastrophic death into the physical body. These grim medical prophecies extracted directly from the Huangdi Neijing hang like a heavy, dark cloud over our modern, brightly lit metropolitan cities, where the natural night is entirely erased by light pollution and the bitter winter cold is almost never truly felt. We have built an entire global infrastructure based on the exact behaviors that ancient physicians identified as fundamentally lethal. The specific biological mechanism behind this rapid physical decay is the terrifying physiological domino effect hidden deep within the traditional cycle of the five elements. If a person completely exhausts their foundational water energy by stubbornly refusing to rest and hibernate during the dark, freezing months of winter, the entire interconnected organ system immediately begins a sequence of irreversible collapse. Without those deep, restored reserves of winter water, the body simply cannot feed the vital wood energy absolutely required for the explosive growth of spring, leaving the human liver completely starved and functionally weak. When that wood element ultimately fails, the intense fire of summer is left dangerously unchecked, burning entirely out of control and systematically consuming the cardiovascular system of the heart. This catastrophic sequential collapse of the five elements can be clearly traced back to the opulent imperial courts of ancient China, where royal physicians meticulously recorded the sudden, agonizing deaths of wealthy nobles. These aristocrats lived in a state of artificial indoor luxury, burning endless supplies of imported charcoal and completely ignoring the bitter, lethal frost waiting just outside their fortified palace walls. Today, this exact same deadly environmental chaos is served directly on our modern dinner plates through the miracle of globalized shipping. We routinely consume watery, cooling tropical tomatoes in the middle of a freezing January blizzard, violently shocking our internal core temperature and effectively killing the essential digestive fire that is biologically needed to survive the harsh external cold. Then, reversing the error entirely, we force down heavy, rich meat stews during the blazing 90-degree heat of summer, trapping a suffocating internal dampness inside a human body that is desperately sweating and trying to cool down. This deceptively simple, everyday act of eating completely out of season violently severs our last remaining biological connection to the rhythms of the natural world. The quiet, ongoing tragedy of this modern dietary chaos is that we are slowly and methodically poisoning ourselves with out-of-season agricultural abundance. By demanding every crop at every time of year, We are literally eating our way into a chronic state of permanent, shivering exhaustion from which the human body can no longer naturally recover. The glowing screens in our hands are not just communication tools. They are a profound and calculated disruption of human survival and cellular repair. When bright artificial light measuring exactly 460 nanometers floods a dark bedroom at midnight, it sends a deeply confusing biological signal to an ancient brain that evolved entirely under the dim, natural light of the moon and stars. This unnatural glare tricks the central nervous system into believing it is trapped in a permanent, unending summer afternoon. The vital, cooling physiological energy known in traditional medicine as yin, which requires absolute unbroken darkness to rebuild cellular tissue, is slowly and systematically destroyed by this endless artificial exposure to synthetic daylight. The quiet theft of our restorative darkness leaves us physically hollowed out, fighting a massive biological war we do not even realize we are losing. Millions of modern workers now suffer from chronic sleep deprivation and cellular degradation, a direct consequence of a lifestyle that actively suppresses the natural production of melatonin in the pineal gland. Look closely at the modern human condition, and you will quickly see a species running on absolute empty. We push ourselves to wake up hours before dawn, drink harsh chemical stimulants loaded with synthetic caffeine, and force our fragile bodies to produce peak cognitive energy during the coldest, darkest months of the year when we should be resting. We are desperately trying to sprint through the dark winter of our lives, demanding the fiery metabolic output of July, while standing in the frozen stillness of January. This relentless drive against the natural environmental current severely taxes the adrenal glands and creates a deep, unsettling exhaustion that no amount of weekend sleep can ever truly cure. This chronic, inescapable fatigue is the direct physical evidence of a severely broken internal rhythm. It manifests in the modern population as persistent brain fog, unexplained joint inflammation, and a resting heart rate that never truly settles, leaving an entire generation functioning in a constant low-grade state of biological panic and systemic burnout. The ultimate turning point in this modern health crisis does not come from a newly patented medical breakthrough or a complex, highly invasive surgical procedure. The true cure is a terrifyingly simple surrender to the massive planetary forces we have spent the last 2 centuries using industrial technology to desperately try and conquer. To truly heal the nervous system, we must accept the profound realization that long-term survival requires us to bow down to the changing seasons. We have to stop fighting the dropping temperatures, stop denying the encroaching dark, and let the natural climate of the earth dictate exactly how we pace our daily lives and manage our caloric intake. Giving up our modern illusion of total environmental control is deeply frightening, yet it remains the only biological pathway back to true physical health. Relinquishing this artificial dominance allows the human nervous system to finally shift out of a sympathetic state of constant alarm and enter the parasympathetic state required to repair damaged tissue and restore vital immune function. Reclaiming this lost ancient wisdom involves strict, incredibly simple steps that begin the exact moment you step outside your front door. It starts by actually noticing the bitter chill of the autumn wind on your face and choosing to consume only the heavy, nutrient-dense root vegetables and warming broths that grow deep in the freezing dirt right now. It means manually turning down the artificial heat and letting the house drop to 65 degrees in the winter, forcing the human body to remember its own natural thermal defenses. These small, deliberate physiological stressors slowly rebuild the broken biological bridge between our fragile, overprotected bodies and the massive, unforgiving earth beneath us. The stark, freezing air waiting just outside your window is no longer a hostile enemy to be avoided, but a strict and necessary teacher guiding you back to physical balance. This cold air actively forces warm blood away from the skin and deep into the vital organs, protecting the heart and kidneys, just as ancient physicians documented centuries ago. This physiological alignment becomes a powerful, highly personal choice against the relentless, extracting demands of modern industrialized society. There is a quiet, radical rebellion in simply turning off the glowing digital screens, shutting down the wireless routers, and choosing to go to sleep early on a dark, freezing December evening while the rest of the world stays awake. By matching your breathing to the slow, heavy rhythm of the cold autumn wind, you actively refuse the modern corporate demand for constant, unyielding productivity. Resting deeply and unapologetically in the dead of winter is not a sign of biological weakness, but a profound, heavily tested evolutionary strategy for ensuring long-term survival and maintaining sharp mental clarity. This deliberate, calculated slowing down allows the bones, the deep connective tissues, and the bone marrow to finally store the massive amounts of energy they will need for the coming spring. Without this critical winter storage phase, the body enters the warming months operating at a massive energetic deficit, leaving it highly vulnerable to seasonal allergies and sudden viral infections. This precise biological mathematics brings us to the lingering historical mystery of the ancient masters who reportedly lived well past 100 years old. Historical medical records from the Han Dynasty describe these elders as having impossibly sharp minds and strong, unbreakable bones long after their peers had faded away, a reality achieved through their absolute, unwavering obedience to the changing sky. The durable, catastrophic consequence of ignoring this ancient obedience is now highly visible in the exploding, unprecedented rates of chronic, unexplained illnesses sweeping across the globe. Modern medical institutions and epidemiologists are finally beginning to document the severe physical toll of what happens when entire populations live for decades, completely disconnected from the natural rhythms of the physical world. This massive, unprecedented cultural shift away from seasonal living has ultimately forced modern scientists to look backward for desperate answers. They are now digging deeply into forgotten medical texts and ancient bamboo scrolls, searching for the exact historical moment we decided we were somehow separate from the Earth, and trying to find a way to reverse the damage before it becomes permanent. The modern city never sleeps, bathed in the harsh artificial glow of street lamps and screens that banish the natural dark of winter. Beneath this endless light, millions of workers push themselves through the cold months, ignoring the ancient biological call to rest and retreat. This relentless pace leaves a heavy, invisible toll on the human body, stripping away the quiet recovery that our ancestors understood was necessary for survival. The result is a profound collective exhaustion, a society running on empty while surrounded by the illusion of constant energy. Medical records from a 2019 study in London revealed the stark physical collapse of night shift workers who lived entirely outside the rhythm of the sun. Doctors documented a shocking rise in severe immune system failures among these individuals, proving that breaking the ancient cycle of light and dark has immediate, dangerous physical consequences. This discovery forced a sudden shift in how modern clinics view chronic illness, moving away from just treating symptoms to questioning how far a patient has drifted from natural seasonal cycles. The long-held assumption that human biology could simply adapt to any schedule was shattered by the undeniable evidence of failing organs and deep fatigue. Traditional Chinese medicine explains that the body stores its deepest energy reserves in the kidneys during the winter, acting like a battery meant to last an entire lifetime. When we refuse to slow down and rest during the dark months, we drain this vital battery, forcing the body to run on nervous tension instead of true strength. Yet a haunting question remains that neither ancient texts nor modern lab results can fully answer. Once this deep foundational energy is completely burned away by years of ignoring the seasons, is it ever truly possible to rebuild it, or are we permanently borrowing time from our own future? The tragedy of this lost connection is felt in the quiet, desperate moments of modern life, where people wake up already feeling entirely drained. It is a deep, unsettling grief for a rhythm we can no longer remember, a biological loneliness that comes from being completely out of step with the earth itself. This widespread suffering has birthed a massive, desperate cultural shift, driving thousands to expensive recovery clinics and silent retreats in a frantic attempt to buy back the rest that nature once provided for free. The lasting consequence is a world that must now actively schedule and pay for the simple act of slowing down. A stark reminder of the harmony we surrendered. The fallout of ignoring these ancient cycles bleeds directly into the heart of the family home, creating a generation of parents who are simply too exhausted to engage with their own children. When the restorative quiet of winter is skipped, the natural burst of energy meant for spring never arrives. This leaves households trapped in a cycle of short tempers and fragile immune systems where every minor seasonal change brings another wave of sickness through the family. The concrete reality is millions of homes operating in a state of permanent low-grade survival, entirely disconnected from the natural vitality that should be their birthright. There is a chilling realization that comes when we look at the modern grocery store, a place completely stripped of natural time, offering summer fruits in the dead of winter. We have traded the deep, comforting wisdom of eating what the cold earth provides for the hollow convenience of having everything at once. This illusion of endless summer has profoundly altered our relationship with nourishment, tricking our bodies into expecting heat and growth when they desperately need warmth and preservation. The sudden rise in chronic digestive failures across the globe is a direct aftershock of this dietary arrogance, proving that the human stomach cannot easily digest the lies we tell it about the seasons. The ancient doctors mapped out how the spleen acts as the body's furnace, requiring warm, cooked foods during the cold months to transform meals into usable blood and energy. When we flood this delicate system with raw, cold foods out of season, the furnace is smothered, leading to a buildup of heavy, toxic dampness within the tissues. But as climate control allows us to live in artificial 70-degree environments year-round, a vital mystery remains unsolved by modern biology. We still do not know the absolute limit of how much artificial climate the human nervous system can endure before it completely loses its ability to regulate its own internal temperature. The sadness of this modern condition is that we have become strangers in our own bodies, no longer able to hear the quiet, intuitive signals that once told us exactly what to eat and when to rest. We have replaced the gentle, shifting guidance of nature with rigid, punishing diet trends that ignore the changing world outside our windows. As a direct result, modern nutritional science is now being forced to slowly integrate these ancient seasonal rules into new dietary guidelines, admitting that a healthy meal in July might be a harmful one in December. This marks a permanent shift in public health, a reluctant but necessary return to the undeniable truth that our bodies are not machines, but living mirrors of the earth. The ancient framework of the 5 elements illustrates a continuous flowing cycle where the health of one organ directly feeds the strength of the next, just as winter melts into spring. When we disrupt this delicate flow by ignoring the seasons, the entire system begins to stutter, forcing the heart and lungs to work twice as hard to maintain basic balance. For the millions of people caught in this modern disruption, the physical toll is a rapid, premature aging that steals away their vitality decades too soon. The ultimate human consequence is a society that lives longer on paper, but spends those final years battling a profound systemic decay that ancient wisdom warned us about thousands of years ago. In the fading light of a winter afternoon, as frost hardens the quiet earth of the Yellow River Valley, an ancient biological truth remains buried just beneath the frozen topsoil. The early physicians who compiled the foundational medical texts over 2,000 years ago understood a harsh, uncompromising reality. Survival was never about conquering the bitter cold through sheer force, but yielding to its absolute authority, obeying a forgotten circadian rhythm written into the very marrow of our bones. When modern society attempts to outsmart winter with artificial daylight and synthetic heat, we wage a losing war against our own cellular biology, draining the deep physiological reserves required to sustain vital organ function through the spring. The ultimate medicine is not some complex chemical remedy forged in a sterile modern laboratory, but rather the quiet, unsettling courage to close our eyes, surrender to the shifting atmospheric pressure of the changing season, and simply let the darkness fall.